The rope burns on Ayana's wrists were still fresh when the wall of sand hit him like the breath of an ancient spirit gone mad. He had been tracking the 3 white men for 2 days across the Sonoran wasteland, following the trail of his stolen horses and the deeper wounds they had carved into his people's sacred hunting grounds. The Apache warrior pressed his weathered face against the red sandstone outcropping as the world disappeared into a churning brown nightmare that swallowed the afternoon sun whole. The wind howled with voices he recognized, the voices of his ancestors warning him that some storms carry more than dust and fury. Through the deafening roar, something else reached his ears, something that made his blood freeze despite the desert heat. It was not the cry of a coyote or the shriek of a mountain cat, but something far more desperate, more human in its anguish. The sound cut through the sandstorm like a knife through leather, a keening wail that spoke of betrayal and abandonment in a language that transcended words. Ayana knew that sound because he had made it himself 3 moons ago when he found his younger brother Nailnish face down in the creek with 2 bullet holes in his back. The Apache warrior pulled his serape tighter around his shoulders and began moving toward the sound, his moccasins finding purchase on rocks he could not see. Each step was a gamble with death as the sandstorm turned the familiar landscape into an alien world where a man could walk off a cliff or into a rattlesnake's nest without warning. But something deeper than survival instinct drove him forward, something that his grandmother Isdzin had taught him when he was barely old enough to draw a bow. She had said that the desert speaks to those who listen, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in the hunt for enemies, but in the choice to answer a stranger's cry for help. The wailing grew stronger as Ayana pushed deeper into the storm, and with it came a new sound that made his warrior's heart skip like a startled rabbit. It was the sound of claws scraping against rock, of paws digging frantically in sand, of 2 creatures fighting not against each other but against something far more sinister than the storm itself. The Apache dropped to his knees and crawled forward, feeling his way across the desert floor until his fingers touched something that should not have been there. Rope. Thick, coarse rope that reeked of white man's hemp and something else, something darker that made his stomach turn. The rope was pulled taut between 2 struggling forms, and as Ayana's hands explored further through the blinding sand, he realized he had found the source of the desperate cries. 2 wild dogs, massive creatures with the lean muscle of desert survivors, were bound together by their necks with a length of rope barely 3 feet long. They had been tied face to face, forced to look into each other's eyes as they slowly strangled themselves in their panic to escape. But this was no accident, no cruel joke played by bored cowhands. The knots were precise, methodical, designed by someone who understood exactly how much rope to allow for maximum suffering without quick death. Someone had wanted these animals to die slowly, to torture each other with their own desperate attempts at freedom. The larger of the 2 dogs, a gray-black beast with scars across his muzzle, had wrapped the rope around a jutting boulder in his frenzy. With each movement, the noose grew tighter around both their throats. Ayana's hands moved quickly but carefully, feeling for his knife while speaking in low Apache words that had always calmed frightened animals. The smaller dog, a desert brown female with intelligent amber eyes, stopped struggling when she heard his voice. She seemed to understand that help had arrived, but the male continued his desperate fight against the rope, his panic making the situation worse with each passing second. The warrior could feel the life ebbing from both creatures as the hemp cut deeper into their necks with every labored breath. As his blade sliced through the first strand of rope, Ayana's mind raced with questions that had no answers. Who would do such a thing to wild animals that posed no threat to anyone? The dogs were clearly not pets or working animals, their lean frames and cautious eyes marking them as creatures who had never known human kindness. Yet someone had taken the time to capture them, bind them in this cruel embrace, and leave them to die in the middle of nowhere during the worst sandstorm in memory. The second strand parted under his knife, and immediately both dogs collapsed to the sand, gasping for air through damaged throats. The female tried to crawl away but lacked the strength, while the male simply lay still, his flanks heaving as he struggled to draw breath through his swollen windpipe. Ayana could see deep rope burns on both animals, wounds that spoke of hours, maybe days, of struggling against their bonds. These dogs had been left to die long before the storm arrived. But as the Apache warrior knelt beside the suffering animals, his trained eye caught something that made his blood run cold. There, half buried in the sand near where the dogs had been bound, was a piece of torn fabric. Blue cavalry cloth with brass buttons still attached. The same blue that the soldiers wore at Fort Bowie, the same brass that had gleamed on the uniforms of the men who had burned his village and scattered his people like leaves in an autumn wind. Suddenly the storm seemed less important than the questions burning in Ayana's mind. Why were cavalry soldiers torturing wild animals in the middle of the desert? What connection could these innocent creatures have to the white man's war against his people? And most troubling of all, how had someone known he would be traveling this exact route, at this exact time, when even he had not decided his path until the storm forced him to seek shelter in these rocks? The wind began to die as quickly as it had risen, and through the thinning veil of sand, Ayana caught sight of something that made his warrior instinct scream danger. In the distance, barely visible through the settling dust, were the silhouettes of 3 riders moving slowly in his direction. They rode with the purposeful gait of men who knew exactly where they were going, men who were not lost or seeking shelter from the storm. They were coming for him, and somehow, the tortured dogs had been the bait in a trap he had walked into like a blind fool. The female dog lifted her head and looked directly into Ayana's eyes, and in that moment he saw something that chilled him more than the approaching riders. Intelligence. Not the simple awareness of an animal, but something deeper, something that spoke of understanding beyond what any wild creature should possess. She knew what was coming. She had known all along. Ayana's fingers tightened around his knife handle as the 3 riders emerged from the dissipating sandstorm like vengeful spirits riding out of a fever dream. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, his blue cavalry uniform pristine despite the storm, as if the desert dust dared not cling to him. Captain Marcus Hartwell of the 7th Cavalry had the kind of pale eyes that missed nothing and forgave less, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had never questioned an order in his life. Well, Apache. Looks like you found our little gift. Hartwell's companions spread out to flank Ayana, their rifles already drawn but held low, a casual threat that spoke of supreme confidence. I have to admit, I wasn't sure our plan would work. Using animals as bait seemed almost too cruel, even for dealing with your kind. The injured dogs lay between Ayana and the soldiers, their labored breathing the only sound in the sudden stillness that had replaced the howling wind. The female lifted her head again, and this time Ayana understood what he saw in her amber eyes. She was not just intelligent, she was trained. These were not wild dogs at all, but something far more precious and dangerous. They were scout dogs, the legendary tracking animals that the Apache had whispered about in council fires for generations, creatures so rare and valuable that men would kill for the chance to own them. You recognize them now, don't you? Hartwell dismounted with the easy grace of a career cavalry officer, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. Meet Keeper and Guardian, the finest tracking team in the entire Southwest. They belonged to your friend Samuel Crow Feather before we convinced him to part with them. You remember Samuel, don't you? The Apache who thought he could play both sides, selling information to the cavalry while pretending to remain loyal to his people. The name hit Ayana like a physical blow. Samuel Crow Feather had been his childhood friend, a man who had saved his life during the raid on Canyon de Chelly, a warrior whose loyalty to the Apache had never been questioned until the day he disappeared without a trace 6 months ago. The idea that Samuel had betrayed his people was impossible to accept, yet here were his prized dogs, bound and tortured as if they had been abandoned by their master's betrayal. Samuel would never sell out his people, Ayana said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. And he would die before he let harm come to these animals. They were gifts from his grandfather, blessed by the medicine men. Captain Hartwell laughed, a sound as empty as wind through a bleached skull. Samuel said the same thing, right up until we showed him what we had planned for the dogs if he didn't cooperate. Funny how a man's principles can crumble when you threaten something he loves more than his own life. He gave us information about Apache movements for 3 months, thinking he could feed us false intelligence without us noticing. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. Samuel had not betrayed his people, he had tried to protect them by feeding the cavalry misinformation while secretly warning the Apache through coded messages only a trained scout would recognize. But somehow the soldiers had discovered his deception, and their revenge had been as cruel as it was complete. They had tortured his beloved dogs not just to punish Samuel, but to use them as bait for other Apache warriors who might be foolish enough to show compassion for suffering animals. Where is Samuel now? Ayanna asked, though he already knew the answer from the satisfied expression on Hartwell's weathered face. Samuel Crowfeather died trying to escape from Fort Bowie 3 days ago, the captain replied with casual cruelty. Shot while attempting to steal his dogs back from our stables. His last words were something about the animals being blessed, about how they would bring justice for his people. Touching, really, the way he believed in Apache superstitions right up to the end. Guardian, the larger male dog, struggled to his feet despite his injuries and moved protectively in front of his mate. Even weakened and dying, the animal recognized the threat posed by the soldiers, and something deep in his canine soul responded to the need to defend what remained of his family. Ayanna saw in that moment why Samuel had been willing to risk everything for these creatures. They were not just dogs, they were living symbols of the bonds that held families and tribes together, the loyalty that transcended death itself. The question now, Captain Hartwell continued, is what we do with you. We could simply shoot you and leave your body for the buzzards, but that would be wasteful. You see, we need more information about Apache hideouts, supply routes, sacred places where your people might be hiding weapons or planning attacks. You're going to provide that information, or you're going to watch these animals die very slowly while you think about your options. One of the flanking soldiers, a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly on his rifle, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Captain, maybe we should just take the Apache back to the fort. General Crook's orders were to avoid unnecessary conflicts with civilian Indians. Hartwell's pale eyes turned toward his subordinate with the kind of cold fury that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. Sergeant Wilson, are you questioning my tactical decisions? Because if you are, I can arrange for you to join our Apache friend in his current predicament. There are no civilian Indians, only enemies of the United States Army who haven't been caught yet. The threat was clear, and Sergeant Wilson's face went pale as he realized he had stepped into dangerous territory. But there was something in his expression that gave Ayanna hope, a flicker of conscience that suggested not all white soldiers were comfortable with their captain's methods. The Apache warrior filed that information away, knowing it might be the key to survival for himself and the injured dogs. Keeper, the female, managed to stand despite her damaged throat and walked slowly toward Ayanna. She pressed her scarred muzzle against his hand, a gesture of trust that spoke volumes about her ability to judge character. In her amber eyes, the Apache warrior saw not just intelligence but wisdom, the kind of understanding that comes only from experiencing both the best and worst of human nature. She had chosen to trust him, just as Samuel had trusted her judgment when he trained her to be more than just a hunting dog. These animals don't deserve to suffer for the conflicts between our peoples, Ayanna said, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that marked him as a man of honor despite his desperate circumstances. Let me take them somewhere they can heal, and I'll tell you what you want to know about the sacred places. But Captain Hartwell was shaking his head before Ayanna finished speaking. I'm afraid it's too late for bargaining, Apache. You see, these dogs represent something more valuable than information. They represent the power to break the spirit of your people by showing them that even their most sacred bonds can be turned into weapons against them. The captain drew his sidearm, a Colt .45 that gleamed in the fading afternoon light, and pointed it directly at Keeper's head. Samuel Crowfeather thought his grandfather's blessing would protect these animals. Let's test the power of Apache medicine against American steel. In that moment, time seemed to slow for Ayanna. He could see the captain's finger tightening on the trigger, could hear Guardian's low growl of defiance, could feel Keeper's trust radiating through the hand she had pressed against his palm. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to fight, to do something other than stand helplessly while innocence was destroyed by men who had forgotten what it meant to be human. But sometimes the greatest courage lies not in action but in faith, and as Ayanna watched death approach the creature who had chosen to trust him, he found himself whispering the same blessing that Samuel's grandfather had spoken over these animals when they were puppies. The words came from somewhere deeper than memory, older than thought, carrying with them the combined prayers of generations of Apache warriors who had believed that some bonds transcend death itself. The effect was immediate and impossible to explain by any logic the white soldiers would accept. A gust of wind, stronger than anything the dying Sandstorm could produce, struck Captain Hartwell just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, and the recoil combined with the unexpected wind knocked the captain backward off his horse. At the same instant, Both dogs seemed to find new strength, their eyes blazing with an inner fire that spoke of connections to powers older than any human understanding. What happened next would be debated around cavalry fires for years to come, though few would ever speak of it openly. The dogs did not attack the soldiers, did not show any aggression that could be used to justify what Captain Hartwell had been about to do. Instead, they simply stood side by side, Guardian's protective stance and Keeper's unwavering gaze creating a living symbol of loyalty that even hardened cavalrymen could recognize and respect. Sergeant Wilson lowered his rifle completely, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain, maybe we should reconsider this. These aren't just animals. They're something more than we understand." But the true miracle was yet to come, because as Ayanna knelt beside the dogs and began tending to their rope burns with strips torn from his shirt, he realized that their injuries were already beginning to heal. Not with supernatural speed, but with the natural resilience of creatures whose spirits had not been broken despite everything they had endured. They would survive, and in their survival lay a message more powerful than any weapon Captain Hartwell could wield. The bonds that matter most cannot be cut by rope or broken by cruelty. Love, loyalty, and the courage to show compassion in the face of hatred are forces that transcend the petty conflicts of nations and races. Samuel Crowfeather had understood this truth, and in his final act of defiance, he had ensured that his beloved dogs would carry that message forward to touch the heart of another Apache warrior who needed to remember what it meant to fight not just for survival, but for the values that make survival worthwhile. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the tears streaming down Ayanna's weathered cheeks, 3 cavalry soldiers rode away in silence. They left behind an Apache warrior and 2 healing dogs, but they carried with them something far more valuable than any military intelligence. They carried the memory of a moment when the true nature of courage had been revealed not through violence, but through the simple act of one broken soul choosing to heal another. As the desert temperature plummeted with the setting sun, Ayanna gathered dry sage and creosote branches to build a fire that would burn low and smokeless through the long Arizona night. The 2 dogs huddled close to his warmth, their breathing still labored from the rope injuries, but their eyes alert to every sound that carried across the cooling sand. In the flickering shadows cast by the flames, the Apache warrior began the ancient healing ritual his grandmother had taught him as a boy, speaking words in the old language that seemed to reach deeper than human understanding. Keeper lifted her head as Ayanna's chanting voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the desert wind, her amber eyes reflecting not just the firelight but something deeper, a recognition that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal consciousness. Guardian remained protective, his scarred muzzle pointed toward the darkness where the soldiers had disappeared, but even his vigilance could not mask the way his breathing grew easier as the Apache words washed over him like a healing balm. The warrior's calloused hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared the poultices from plants he gathered in the dying light. Desert willow bark for the rope burns, prickly pear cactus gel for the swelling, and most sacred of all, a handful of ghost plant that grew only in places where Apache blood had been spilled in defense of the sacred places. His grandmother had told him that this ethereal white flower carried the spirits of warriors who had died protecting their people, and that it would only reveal its healing power to those who understood the true cost of courage. But as Ayanna worked by firelight to treat the dog's injuries, his trained tracker's eye began to notice details that filled him with a growing sense of unease. The rope that had bound the animals was not cavalry-issue hemp, but something far more expensive, the kind of silk-wrapped cord used by wealthy Mexican ranchers for their prize horses. The brass buttons he had found earlier bore not the eagle of the United States Army, but an intricate design that he recognized from his childhood raids into Sonora, the coat of arms of the Valdez family. Don Carlos Valdez had been the most powerful man in northern Mexico before the American conquest, a silver baron whose vast estate stretched from the Gulf of California to the Rio Grande. More importantly, he had been the only white man to ever earn the respect of Ayanna's grandfather, a relationship built on mutual understanding and shared hatred for the Mexican government that had betrayed them both. The old Don had died 5 years ago, but his son Miguel had inherited not just his father's wealth, but also his network of spies and informants that reached into every corner of the borderlands. The implication struck Ayanna like a physical blow. Captain Hartwell and his men were not acting on official army orders, but as mercenaries in the employ of Miguel Valdez. The torture of Samuel's dogs had been designed not to extract information about Apache movements, but to draw specific warriors into carefully laid traps. Someone with intimate knowledge of Apache customs and individual personalities was feeding information to the Mexicans, someone who knew that Ayana would risk his life to save suffering animals, just as Samuel had died trying to protect the creatures he loved. Guardian suddenly raised his head, a low growl rumbling in his damaged throat as his keen ears picked up sounds that human senses could not detect. In the distance, barely visible in the starlight, three shapes moved across the desert with the purposeful gait of men who knew exactly where they were going. But these were not the same soldiers who had ridden away hours earlier. These were Apache warriors, and they were approaching the fire with the stealth of hunters closing in on dangerous prey. Ayana's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, but Keeper's gentle pressure against his leg stayed his motion. There was something in the female dog's behavior that suggested she recognized the approaching figures, not as enemies to be feared, but as allies whose arrival had been anticipated. Her tail, despite her injuries, began to move in the slow, careful wag of an animal greeting familiar friends. The lead warrior stepped into the circle of firelight with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life moving silently through hostile territory. Nate, war chief of the Chiricahua band, stood 6 feet tall in his moccasins, his weathered face bearing the scars of 100 battles and the wisdom that comes only from surviving when lesser men have fallen. His two companions, brothers named Chato and Yanoza, flanked him with rifles ready but not aimed, their dark eyes studying the scene with the practiced assessment of professional killers. Samuel Crow Feather's dogs, Nate said simply, his voice carrying the authority of a man whose word could mean life or death for anyone within 100 miles. We have been tracking the men who stole them for many days, following a trail of blood and betrayal that reaches deeper than we first understood. The war chief knelt beside Keeper and examined her injuries with the gentle touch of a man who understood that healing required both strength and tenderness. These animals carry more than Samuel's blessing, brother. They carry secrets that powerful men would kill to protect, information that could change the balance of power between our people and the Mexicans who seek to drive us from our ancestral lands. Ayana felt his world shift like sand in an earthquake as Nature's words revealed the true scope of the conspiracy surrounding them. Samuel Crow Feather had not simply been a double agent feeding false information to the cavalry, he had been part of a larger network of Apache and Mexican patriots working together to prevent American expansion from destroying both their peoples. The dogs had been trained not just for tracking and hunting, but as living messengers, capable of carrying coded information across vast distances without arousing suspicion from soldiers who saw them as nothing more than animals. Chato, the younger of the two brothers, approached the fire and added his own bundle of healing herbs to Ayana's collection. Samuel taught them to recognize specific scents, sounds, and even hand signals that could convey complex tactical information. They know the location of hidden water sources, secret trails through the mountains, and most dangerous of all, the identities of Mexican officials who have been secretly supporting our resistance against American occupation. The pieces of the puzzle continued falling into place with terrifying clarity. Don Miguel Valdez had not ordered the torture of the dogs out of simple cruelty, but because he needed to extract the information stored in their trained memories before that knowledge could be used against his own interests. The wealthy Mexican had been playing a complex double game, publicly supporting American authority while secretly funding Apache raids that would destabilize the region and make it ungovernable for the new territorial government. Yanoza, whose scarred hands spoke of years spent crafting weapons for the resistance, produced a leather pouch from his shirt and scattered its contents near the fire. Maps drawn on deer hide revealed a network of hidden camps, supply caches, and safe passages that stretched from the Sierra Madre to the Colorado River. Each location was marked not with Apache symbols, but with tiny paw prints that could only be read by someone who understood the secret language Samuel had taught his dogs. Captain Hartwell was supposed to kill you tonight, Nate continued, his voice as cold as the desert wind. But something went wrong with their plan. The storm provided cover for our approach, and we were able to observe their actions without being detected. What we saw convinced us that the situation is far more dangerous than we realized. The war chief reached into his own pouch and withdrew an object that made Ayana's blood freeze in his veins. It was a human scalp, still fresh, with the distinctive white hair of an elderly Apache medicine man. The scalp belonged to Goyathle, the sacred keeper of the old ways who had been living in secret somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains, preserving the ancient knowledge that connected his people to the land itself. Goyathle was murdered 2 days ago, Nate said, his voice heavy with grief and rage. tortured for information about the sacred places where our ancestors buried their greatest treasures. Someone told the killers exactly where to find him, someone who knew that the old man would die before revealing the secrets he had sworn to protect. The implications hit Ayanna like a war club to the skull. The network of Apache informants working for Miguel Valdez had been compromised from within, betrayed by someone who had access to the most sacred knowledge of their people. The dogs had been tortured not just to extract tactical information, but to identify the traitor whose actions had already led to the death of one of the most revered holy men in Apache history. Keeper struggled to her feet and walked slowly to where the maps lay scattered in the firelight. With her injured muzzle, she carefully nudged one specific marking, a paw print that indicated a water source near the Mexican border. But when Ayanna looked more closely, he realized that the mark was different from the others, slightly larger and positioned in a way that suggested not just a location, but a warning. Guardian joined his mate, his damaged throat producing sounds that were not quite growls but something more complex, a form of communication that transcended normal canine vocalization. The two dogs were trying to tell them something crucial, something that Samuel had trained them to remember even under the most extreme circumstances. As the desert night deepened around the flickering fire, for Apache warriors and two injured dogs faced a truth that was more terrifying than any enemy they had ever confronted. Somewhere among their own people, a traitor was systematically destroying the network of resistance that represented their last hope for survival in a world that had no place for Apache freedom. The sacred places were being violated, the holy men murdered, and the ancient knowledge that connected them to their ancestral homeland was being sold to the highest bidder. But in that moment of despair, as the cold stars wheeled overhead and the desert wind carried the scent of distant rain, something unexpected happened. Keeper pressed her scarred muzzle against Ayanna's hand and looked directly into his eyes, and in that gaze he saw not just intelligence or loyalty, but recognition. She knew who the traitor was, and she was ready to help him exact the justice that her murdered master would never live to see. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, the Apache would not be the prey.